Welcome, everyone, to DEI After 5, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator, and coach, Sacha Thompson. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of DEI After 5. Okay, so if you have been listening to anything in socials or on the news, AI is the conversation. Everything is about AI. And it's interesting because when I was working in corporate, a few years back, I'll just say that, we were starting to have conversations about artificial intelligence and machine learning and the impacts of that. Fast forward to now, and we're really starting to see what this means. And so today, we're going to talk about some of the impacts that AI is starting to have on DEI efforts, specifically recruiting, but other aspects of this work as well. And so my guest today is Alexandra Zellin, who is a specialist in this area, who really is very knowledgeable about what's really going on kind of the day-to-day with some of the laws that's taking place, specifically around AI in the workplace. And so, Alexandra, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Sacha. I'm so glad to be here.
So for folks that may not know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about you and then kind of how you got into this work?
Yeah, so I have my PhD in industrial organizational psychology, and I started out actually in academia. So I was in academia for 6.5 years, and ended up leaving for quite a few reasons. One of them, I do DEI, and I was in a very red state, making a lot of laws against what you could and could not teach. And so that became, really problematic for me of how can I hold true, to who I am. And so I recently moved into the corporate world, and I have a side consulting business that really focuses on DEI. Is there any sort of like adverse impact? Is there any sort of, bias, especially in using AI against people who aren't essentially white men?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm nodding and smiling about that because that's the conversation we were having years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
And talking about some of the challenges. And, it was very public. There were a few actually women of color that were in tech, at Google specifically. Mm-hmm. And there was one other, I can't remember if she was at Twitter, formerly known as Twitter. I don't even know what to call it. We all know.
Either.
That place, where they were talking about, the data sets and the importance of having diversity in those data sets and who was putting this information in, because the output could be harmful or damaging, right? And so that's kind of what we're talking about, because now what we were talking about then was really very limited access, right? There were certain agencies, and one of the reasons why we were having the conversation was because police departments were using, AI and machine learning.
Yep.
And so some of the harm that could have happened and did happen because of that. So fast forward now, and AI has become a tool that everyone has access to, everyone can use. But those data sets may or may not have shifted the way that they needed to, right? So talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges that you were seeing as it relates to diversity and inclusion kind of today.
Yeah. So great question. And one of the big things to understand about AI is that it's using data that already exists to kind of make that prediction. So if you remember back in stats, whenever you last took stats a long time ago, you have like the y equals mx plus b, right? In your algebra, right? And you're predicting that line, and what does that look like? And to get that, you have to use data. And so a lot of organizations are using data that they plug into their system, and then they look at the outcome and go, oh, this is great. We've been doing this. And to be fair, industrial organizational psychologists have actually been doing this for a while. It's just that we are trained to look deeper into the data, and we have a ton of laws and regulations, even within our own society, around what do you do for hiring, right? And what does the hiring look like for it? Now, the problem that we've seen, and Sacha, you mentioned this, and people might remember, for instance, Amazon a few years ago tried to do, let's predict who would be great in this tech position. So what they did is they took the resumes of the people currently in the position, which in theory sounds great. But it turns out all the people in that position had essentially the same demographic. And so their resumes looked the same. And so when they fed it into the system, what came out was, if we're comparing all these,
we're the same
to it, these matches, this matches, this is great. And it turns to be the exact same character, the exact same person who's already employed. So a lot of this is, yes, we have data, but do we have good data, or do we have data of just one subgroup? Even if you think in medicine, right? Medicine is based upon white men's symptoms and experiences. You'll have here's the signs of a heart attack. And you go, but for women, the signs of a heart attack are, and you're like, wait a minute.
Different. Very different. Yeah. Yeah. And so using the examples that you've used, right? It's so important to have that diverse data, right? That you're pulling from. But oftentimes, to your point, we don't even know what we don't even have, right? Like we don't even see the gaps in our data because it's just what we've always had. And so what are some ways that organizations can, because they may not be able to fill the gaps, but what are some ways that they can at least be cognizant of, okay, there is a discrepancy here, or there is a gap here. How do we start to address that?
Yeah, great question. So we talk about this a lot with regards to hiring, and with regards to what are the steps that people have to go through for the hiring process, which has been, as we know, a huge debate recently on LinkedIn of do you have the green banner? How many interviews do you have to go through? That sort of stuff. And it really starts because AI that we've seen legislatively has been in the hiring process. And it really starts with what even questions are you using? And are these questions that are developed in a way that's specifically related for this particular role, right? It has job relevance, we know what it's talking about. And are they intended to reduce bias? Now, we cannot always predict if bias will be an outcome, right? Some people very much want to say, this is always going to get you bias. You might have done that in Florida and it was great, right? There was no indication of bias or what we would call adverse impact against any particular group. But you take that same test and you give it in New York City, even if it's for firefighters, right? Same organization that we're using it for. And we could have totally different results.
Because you have different demographics in those locations. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. So it's understanding that just because it worked in one area doesn't necessarily mean something's going to work somewhere else. So making sure it's as, job and role specific as possible, while also paying attention to areas that could induce, some sort of bias. Like for instance, it used to be firefighters had to be a certain height. And they did that to make sure women could not become firefighters, to make sure that Asians or people with an Asian background could not become firefighters. So it was very much intended to be this is what it is, but you have to be this tall to rescue people. And my stance when I taught, personnel selection was, if you can pick my butt up and throw me over your shoulder and get me out of a burning building, I don't care who you are, what you look like, I don't care. You got me out of this burning building. Right. But a lot of times that past history has continued to evolve into, here's the justification, obviously, and not understanding that. Have you actually looked into that more recently, and have things changed?
I love that example because it really forces critical race theory, right? It really forces you to think critically of, why is this the way that it is, right? What are the historical patterns or, some of the context that created this,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when you think of, the examples that you use, I immediately started thinking about redlining. I started thinking about like how schools are funded based on, who's in those areas. But when you think of the historical context of that, so many redlined areas don't have the taxes
Mm-hmm.
to help with the schools. And so therefore schools are underfunded, and
Mm-hmm.
the rolling effect of that. And so if you are looking at data for these places and locations, right, of course there's going to be skewed
Mm-hmm.
because historically it was set up that way.
Yes, yes, there is a lot of history, as you know, based in these areas. And I will say that I'm going to use the SAT as an example, and the SAT has very not great backgrounds, right? I want to be very clear.
Yep.
I'm not a huge proponent of the SAT. But when you take the SAT, when you take the GRE, you're scored on the verbal and a math, but then you have like these extra sections that they're trying to quote unquote like validate, that, hey, if you answered these questions correctly on questions we've already gone through a bunch of people on, then you should get these right or wrong. But then they're also using it to determine, are there differences, right? Based upon your demographics, are people more likely to answer this question this way or this question this way? And if there's a large difference, in theory, I don't know the workings of the SAT and the GRE, but then they shouldn't be using those questions in the future. But that's an example of how at least one organization has tried to prevent questions that they know are like, oh, we know this one's going to be bad, from being used in the future.
Yeah. And I just, I remember years, I'm trying to think, did I even take the SAT during this time? I remember the conversation around, even how some of the questions were stated were very culturally specific. And so students didn't even have the context of being in that situation to even know how to start to answer the question. Right. And so that's how a lot of this happened. And so to your point, it was starting to say, okay, well, these students are going to score better than these students over here, and then the long-term impact of that. So, okay, I want to do not a little bit of a pivot, like same conversation. When we started talking about this, we were having some conversations about like laws are now being created around disclosure, around, how almost like regulating AI to some degree. So can you talk to us a little bit about that, and like what is that looking like now?
Yeah. So as with, I'm not going to say all laws, because not all laws are created with positive intent in mind, right? To be clear, this is an attempt to ensure that public data is available. So that way, who is being hired, who is not being hired, what questions. And when I say who, I don't mean people specifically, but specific demographic groups. If they're being negatively impacted through the testing that's used in the hiring process. So really, it's just kind of opening a door to what we've been doing on the backside to what's actually happening, right, for everyone to see it. So in the public sector, everything's always been essentially public, right? If you're in police, if you're in firefighters, you are like, you're all, these 20 people are going up for the next role. Like, who gets it and who doesn't.
Right.
But as you all know, that's not the case within the private sector.
Yep.
And so New York City was one of the first to really start to say, okay, hey, wait a minute. We need a lot more education. We need a lot more openness of what AI is doing in the background. So again, IO psychologists, we've been doing data analysis in the background for a long time. And one of our key, I guess, events, stakeholdering things, like one of the most important things we are paying attention to in the back end is, oh, wait a minute. We say a cutoff score, you have to get, 70% on this, whatever it was, to be able to move on to the next round. And if we look at that and go, oh gosh, hold up 1 second. This one group, we had 20 people and now we have 2. that's a big problem. And when we say 20 to 2, maybe it's X group, but of, for instance, white people, all 20 of 20 made it through. So that's when we're like, okay, hey, wait a minute, this is not okay. So the typical statistic that we use is about 80%. So did 80% of one group make it through of like the majority group? So if 17, that's not even a good number to work with. If 20, right, of 100 make it through of people who are white, then what is the 80% that we work with for any other particular group?
Right.
Now, again, it has its problems. It's not perfect, but it does allow us to see, are there big areas of problems? What it doesn't allow us to get into is the intersectional aspect. And so like, well, what about the hiring of Black women? Well, what about the hiring of Black Christian women? Not that we ask about your religion. Or what about like Black gay women or Black lesbian women or, Black bi women? We can't really get that. And part of it is, you can't have a data size of 1 or 2. I mean, you do and you have it, but you can't do a whole lot with it. So really these laws were meant to kind of open the doors, open the window shades, as people would say, to let people know what's kind of going on in the background, especially because there is a whole lot of distrust around AI.
It's so interesting because as you're talking about this, what I'm thinking of is it also forces questions. Like if you're truly curious, it forces some questions around systemic barriers and challenges, right? So using that example, if there's a group of 100 white folks and 80% go through, but 100, let's say Black and brown folks, and only 20% get through, my immediate question isn't what's wrong with the data set. I'm kind of going back, okay, like what are some of the systemic barriers and challenges that may be impacting that, right? Does everyone have access to the same information, training materials? Are they going through similar processes to prepare, right? Like I'm starting to really think through, that's the equity part, right? Like how do we remove some of those barriers or provide some additional support that everyone now is working from the same level playing ground, right? Playing field. But then there are, I hate the phrase devil's advocates, but there are, folks that will say, well, it is what it is. Like this group, they're just better than this group. And so the sociologist in me, was like, there's something else there. There's something that may be helping or hindering in either way. And so when I'm listening to you and around these laws, it really is to me in my mind, creating a pause of let's really sit here and think about what's going on here, right? Yes, we have this data. Now that we have this data, what is it telling us? What is it showing us? And what do we need to do to right some of these inequities that we're seeing? Can you tell us, or do you know, like has there been any pushback on these laws that have come up?
Yeah, so a lot of it is people are unclear, right? And a lot of people are now hiring remote. Well, the number is shrinking now that we've gotten farther into 2023. But the New York City laws make it clear that, hey, if you're hiring anyone from New York City is within your talent pool, you need to be conducting these analyses. The strong organizations are already conducting those analyses. They're already doing it in the background. The New York law just demonstrates that, hey, even if you're already doing it, you need an outside source, right? Someone who's not affiliated with you to be able to run these analyses. And for those of you who aren't doing it, you need to get this done, right? Because we need to be looking for this equity. From what I've seen, not a whole ton of people have necessarily been posting. But then again, not many people are happily posting things that they're not doing very well, if they're not doing them very well, right? If it's posted, it's not necessarily going to be somewhere that people are generally easily going to be clicking on. And again, if you're working with an organization that's already doing it, they're in theory going to be providing you with, hey, we need to stop and reconsider. And this is even before the laws, came into effect, because they're like, there's a problem. Our questions, whatever we're doing, they're not providing equal access, right? We are blocking out a group. We need to change something within our process.
Yeah.
And you brought up a great point, right? Like, what's the background? What's the barriers? A lot of it was, and not as much, well, still recently, but do they have a college education? And it's like, well, maybe people in the 70s and 80s didn't have a college education, but they're still a great part of our workforce, and they've learned a ton, right? Look at all that on-the-job knowledge, but you're going to say, no, you don't have a college education? Sorry about you.
Yeah.
So, there is a lot of that background that forces us to go in and reconsider and say, ooh, there is an issue. Why does a college degree, equate to success in this particular role?
Yeah. And it's so funny you say that, because this morning I was looking at a post on LinkedIn where, in tech, that's a big thing where a lot of those organizations are starting to drop that requirement. It's more of, nice to have, but it's no longer a requirement to have a college degree. And what they are noticing is there's an increase, but it's an increase of everyone, right? Because that was a barrier for so many people. White, Black, Asian, like not everyone has a college degree or the opportunity to go to a 4-year institution.
Right.
And so what they saw was an increase across the board in access. So I'm loving that piece of it. What I'm really curious about is, because this is kind of the front end of things. This is recruiting, getting people in the door, which most organizations, give or take, are doing somewhat well anyway, right? Like, this just kind of is an added layer to, let's be much more intentional about our inclusive processes and procedures. Now I'm kind of going to like the retention piece of it, and the potential of using AI for that as well. Because now you are dealing with, we do know the demographics. Usually on the front end, you're limited in what you can capture. But once you got folks in the door, you can capture all of that information, right? So I haven't seen anything recently, and maybe you have, or have some idea, but can AI be used in that part of the process to understand, okay, people's experiences within the workplace and discrepancies there, and who's reporting to HR, the types of issue, all of those things. I think AI can easily be used for those things, but have you seen anything about that recently?
Yeah. So I think, that's the trend that a lot of people are going, right? Is to try to use AI, and they're saying, oh no, what do we do? Like human resources, they're trying to out human resources. AI is based upon the data that's fed in. Someone has to read the data. Someone has to know the people, right? Like, you can't get rid of HR just because you might be introducing AI. But just like how AI is being used everywhere else, there's a lot of learning left to do. There was a study that was recently released, and I'm blanking on who the author was or the authors were, but they tried to do, based upon performance ratings, how did these people rate? And then how did AI rate them? And they weren't the same, but they were both biased, just in different ways. And so it's still, it's still a problem. You still need that human to look at it and to understand kind of what's happening. So AI is essentially how do I read the data and just kind of spit out what it is? But someone has to understand the data. Like, you can have an Excel spreadsheet, but you can just look at numbers all day. If you don't know what they mean or how they interact, then it doesn't help very much. I think AI could actually be really beneficial. And you talk a lot about like culture change, right? And coaching, and how do we coach people to change the culture, bottom up, top down, middle out, all the different ways. And I think part of the culture change also comes from changing a lot of what the organization has like set in stone and set in place, whether it's their values, whether it's all of their documentation of, you can do this, but you can't do that, but you can do this, like all their policies. I think honestly, having AI go through them and searching for ways that they are problematic would be humongous. Like, I think that is a phenomenal use.
It's a great starting point, at least. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I love that. I never thought about that.
Yeah. Well, and consistent training of it too, right? Because like
Yeah.
things continue to change. There is, what used to be, and not all that long ago, hey, smiling demonstrates that you're polite, like looking someone in the eye and smiling. And, I just recently got to push back. I said, well, from a cultural standpoint, eye contact and smiling isn't always demonstrating respect. And
Mm-hmm.
also, if you are neurodiverse, eye contact might be really hard.
Difficult.
Right. And it's not okay to say, like, this is a standard and you're not living up to it because you're not meeting expectation of the group that's in power.
Right.
But, just continuously running things through because things change. You find out new information all the time. But I think AI can really help kind of pinpoint, hey, here's some things to flag that you might need to pay more attention to.
I love that. And again, it's working with technology, not having technology work for you.
Yes.
Like there's a slightly different mindset with that.
Mhm.
And so I love the fact that you said, it's about someone needs to interpret the data.
Yep.
Because data is just data. Data is numbers and words. It's you have to know, the people. You have to be able to understand. And it's so funny because even when I don't use AI to do the assessments that we do.
Mhm.
But I'm always saying, okay, like here's the data that I'm seeing. This is the information. I'm just sharing it with you. You know the people, you know the stories. So talk to me about this. Like I'm providing you a framework, but I need you to tell me the story so that this
Mhm.
makes sense. Right. And
Mhm.
so we can start to have really great conversations, but it needs that human element to be able to really talk about, okay, what's going on here?
Mhm.
Because what this data is telling me is either, black or white, or, it's there's very little gray with data.
Right.
And so you need that color, that nuance to
Mhm.
be added into it.
Mhm.
Okay. So I'm gonna do my little pivot now. Because I mean, this is just really fascinating work. Because I came from tech, like I'm
Mhm.
somewhat still connected in that mind space. I'm very curious about it. And but it's overwhelming. It is a lot
Mhm.
of information, and especially now how we get information, like it can just be a floodgate.
Yes.
And then the same me that loves all this information, and as we were talking earlier, like the ancestry DNA, I can go down that rabbit hole. Um, you need to check out sometimes, right? So what are the things that you do? Like, how do you fill your cup? What are the things you do to take care of yourself?
Yeah. So I work from home. And I have honestly found that exercising at the end of my day, I was never a morning person. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm awake and happy, but you want me to exercise in the morning? Good luck. Never going to happen. Um, Exercising after work really helps me because I put like that stop to it and I have a completely
Mm.
different mindset. And it's great because I take classes and people tell me what to do. I don't have
Mm.
to think, I don't have to process. They say, do this lifting activity. Awesome. Okay, now do this one. Okay, I got that. Right. So it's having someone tell me what to do just really completely, switches the brain to a totally different platform. And it's nice.
I never thought of it that way.
Hmm.
I love that. Because I do an AM, like a 7 AM workout,
Ah.
which mentally, especially this, I'm just like, okay, I'm not a morning person. Um, but when I get there, I'm like, okay, I'm starting my day off right, and I
Mhm.
leave so energized and I can really hit my day.
Mhm.
But I like that it's almost all right, I'm totally closing out. I'm checking out. Tell me what to do. I love that. Let me go find an afternoon class. Okay.
Well, to be fair, some people really love exercising in the morning and it starts, as you said, starts their day off right. I end up sleeping the rest of the day. Like if I'm exercising in the morning, you will find me head on the desk, like I am out. So
That's the
exercising,
balance.
right, right. So after work, okay, then I, exercise, I eat, I relax a little bit. Okay, look, now it's bedtime, right? It fits right on in.
That is so true. Because yeah, by 3 o'clock, I'm just like, okay, I'm done.
Mhm.
I'm mm. Brain's not working anymore. So if folks wanted to find you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, honestly, LinkedIn is the best way to find me. I'm not as active posting, right, as Sacha or a lot of your other amazing guests that I just follow and right, I learned so much from. But I'm definitely on LinkedIn as the best way to reach me.
Wonderful. Alexandra, thank you so much for joining us today. I learned a lot, again, being in the tech space and knowing about AI, just seeing the impacts and how it's being used now in
Hmm.
this space, right? In the DEI space.
Hmm.
This is a slightly different conversation. And
Yeah.
so I appreciate you sharing with us today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining in on this episode of DEI After 5. As always, you can find us here every Tuesday at 5:15 p.m. on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, all the things. And until next time, have a good one.